jump right in and, oh, here we go. I actually finished the book Move before COVID, and then I had a chance to update it because we delayed the release. And COVID became this, obviously, a disruption on a global scale. And people said to me, wow, you're writing a book about the future of human geography and mobility, but we're in the middle of the most unprecedented lockdown in all of history. How could you possibly be making this argument? And it didn't bother me at all, quite frankly, because I was looking at how in the 100,000 or actually 300,000 year history of mankind migrating and colonizing the continents, particularly the last 100,000 years from our emergence out of Africa and so forth. There have been many, many drivers of human mobility, many motivations. And those include everything from obviously climate change to persecution, to labor shortages, to technological disruptions, and so on and so forth. And when you look at the world today, all of those drivers of human mobility are really in overdrive. It is not something that is going to stop the patterns that have evolved over many centuries and millennia that are themselves really accelerating. If anything, the way I saw it, these disruptions, each of which constitute some kind of crisis, more or less spurs and stimulates yet more mobility. And so it's that the complex chain reactions between events and the impact they have on human geography that I wanted to kind of do a deeper study on. But in any case, right now we're in the midst of so many different simultaneous crises, right? COVID, climate change, geopolitical ones, social unrest, political polarization, supply chain disruption, and so forth. And very often people speak as if our political systems are capable of prioritizing, sequencing, and tackling these issues individually. You may remember people saying early during COVID that, well, if we're going to have a long-term lockdown, there'll be reduced industrial activity, there'll be lower pollution, the skies will clear, emissions will come down. Maybe this is the way in which we'll tackle climate change. Of course, that was total nonsense, right? 2019 was yet another, or 2020 was yet another year of record greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change obviously continues unabated. So the message here is that you don't get to pick your crisis, and that good governance, whether it's at the municipal level, federal level, international level, really is a race against complexity. It's about trying to anticipate the chain reactions among these different kinds of disruptions and thinking about how we adapt to them. What are the kind of policies that we can implement, sort of knowing or thinking through foresight, maybe even to some degree informed by artificial intelligence, understanding what comes next and thinking about anticipatory governance. So at the end of the day, for me, technology is about, right, how do we use it, right? Are we using it to get ahead of this ever intensifying complexity of the world? And as you know, as I was just going back hundreds of thousands of years, it's civilizations that have risen and fallen really based upon whether they're able to grapple with the complexity that they themselves have created. And often that has to do with things like food production systems, supply chain dependencies, and so on and so forth. So all of this applies very much to cities because, of course, we are in an urbanizing world. This is a map that I produced some years ago that overlays the density, population density of the world, and with overlays these kind of mega city clusters. Now, this is interesting because a lot of people also said during COVID, well, this marks a profound turning point. People are going to become Zoom workers, remote workers. They're not going to live in big cities anymore. And everyone's going to move out to the countryside and just, enjoy Wi-Fi and video games and universal basic income all day long. Well, that's not really true for a number of reasons. First of all, even if that may be true of you, if you live in France or in Canada or something like that, it's certainly not true on a global scale. Globally, of course, most people are Asians in Asia, right? And I've written a previous book about that. I can tell you for sure, living here in Asia, there is no reversal of urbanization on a large scale, right? And therefore, if Asians are still moving into cities, then the world is still moving into cities by the simple law of mathematics. So the people are still urbanizing because they're looking for that wage arbitrage, for better public services, education opportunities, and so on and so forth. And it will probably always be that way. So the question is not whether or not the city will win, right? People who argue that are almost wrong by definition. It's really which cities will prevail, right? So which cities will prevail will depend on a number of things, such as, of course, which ones cope with complexity, because cities, the bigger the city, the more it actually depends on supply chains, the more it depends on agriculture, connectivity, investment with other parts of the world. And actually, when Neil Brenner, when he used to be at Harvard, when he coined the term planetary urbanization, he actually didn't mean that everyone is moving to cities and that the world is defined by ever larger cities. What he actually meant was that because so many of us live in cities, the footprint of the city is actually everywhere. It's the whole world. The city's supply chains, if you will, wind up dominating the planet. And it's the quantification of that, the tracing of that, that constitutes this planetary urbanization phenomenon that we find ourselves in. I've taken the view that because states depend so much on cities, especially the large cities here, cities not only have a lot of diplomatic and political leverage, but they also have to take on certain self-governing or autonomous characteristics and be more responsible for their own governance. And that's why we're starting to see this divergence between federal politics, let's say the Brexit view of the world, versus urban politics, which is of course more about openness, inclusion, connectivity, talent, and so forth. And we see that divergence more and more. And I think the more powerful cities get, the more they will seize upon this agenda of the need to be more effectively self-governing. And of course, using technology more smartly, if you will, than very slow federal governments tend to. Now let's look at climate change and its impact on all of this, because again, you don't get to pick your crisis. We can't forestall our reckoning with climate change and the ways in which cities and populations in cities will have to cope with climate change, just because we're busy right now with COVID and with Ukraine and so forth. So this is a map of the present distribution of the world population, same base layer as the other map actually. But now look closely at what happens when you animate, when you layer in what's called the suitability index, right? So the suitability index is ranking geographies or color coding geographies based upon the relative increase or decrease in suitability for human habitation relative to its past. So places in red, it's not to say that you can never live there, but it's to say that they're becoming less and less livable. Now, a lot of people thought that the map like this would be the world that we might get to by 2040 under a worst case, IPCC derived RCP 8.5 scenario, right? The RCP 8.5 is currently considered the worst case scenario where emissions continue unabated to the year 2100. But of course, if you look at South Asia, for example, this is the map, this is the color that you've seen in the front page of the news, right? It's already happened in the last 2 weeks. The heat wave has been so unprecedented across South Asia. So to some degree, we live in this world already in terms of the relative worsening of conditions. Now, remember, I layered this map onto a demographic map. So one of the things that is apparent as you superimpose them is that the majority of the world population lives in places that are becoming less and less livable. Not only is that the case, it's particularly true of young populations, right? So here we are in a situation where the world population is actually reaching a plateau, right? Currently 8 billion, probably rising to 9.5 billion. There's a very vigorous debate about the total population dynamics. I take the view that the world population will not exceed 10 billion people, which is a low end estimate. But I think that I'll be proven correct when we next do our kind of macro forecasting in a couple of years' time, because the COVID effect has been so terrible, the so-called baby bust of COVID. So we're in a situation where the majority of the world's population and most of the world's young people are in developing countries, emerging economies that are in increasingly difficult environmental circumstances. Meanwhile, the places in green that are becoming more livable have fewer and fewer people, if not for immigration, because of the mortality rate, aging populations, and very low fertility. So this, to me, is the greatest paradox in the world. This is not just a paradox, it's really a perverse situation. In fact, I cannot think of anything more perverse in the world than this map right here. That here we are as human civilization with a finite number of people and reaching a plateau, what I call peak humanity, and the young people who are our future, this future of our species, is mostly in the wrong places. That's more or less a factual statement or prognosis or diagnosis of where we are. And of course, the IPCC doesn't tell us how to get out of this situation. United Nations Security Council doesn't tell us how to escape this trap. Joe Biden is not helping us get out of this situation. There is no roadmap. There is no plan, right? So what we're experiencing is a very profound misalignment, a misalignment in the following layers of geography: where the resources are, where the people are, where the borders are, and where the economic activity is, right? Economic activity, of course, means cities. So a profound misalignment between the geography, between demographics, resources, borders, and industry, right? These four layers of geography are massively, massively out of sync. And correcting that mismatch is the main reason why I wrote the book, but it's also an observation about the human condition on Earth at a fundamental level. Now, how do we correct that? We can correct it through eliminating or relocating borders. Yes, that happens incrementally, but very, very incrementally. We can do it through preservation of environmental ecosystems and habitats so that there is a natural resource abundance in the geographies where people are. But of course, we're not doing that successfully because climate change is, if anything, has been accelerating faster than we would like. The other two ways involve our investments in technologies and productivity. Then the question becomes where and for whom. And the final way is through population resettlement, right? Through a new map, an evolving map of our human geography. And that's why, I mean, the book is called Move. So I'm obviously not advocating stasis, right? I'm advocating and forecasting what may amount to an ever larger resettlement of human populations. Now, you're probably familiar with this idea, this notion of the climate niche. The climate niche is a description of the optimal latitudes in which humans have settled over the last 10,000 years since the retreat of the last ice age. And we have concentrated in this stable band of latitudes between the equator and 30 degrees north latitude. Between 20 and 30 degrees latitude is the most dense. The 27th parallel, for those who are interested in some trivia, has more human beings than any other parallel in the world. 27 degrees north latitude. You can sort of walk around the world at 27 degrees north latitude. You'll encounter more people than any other parallel. But as scientists are telling us, for every 1 degree of climate change, of temperature rise, about 1 billion people are pushed out of that niche. And I believe that as the niche moves, people will move. That's, again, what we've always done. If you go back 300,000 years, that is what humans do. We are a nomadic species. We don't think of ourselves as nomadic, but for most of our history, in fact, we were nomadic. But what does this mean for cities? Because cities, of course, are fixed infrastructures, right? Are our cities in the right places, you might even ask? Right now, if you take a map of the world's leading commercial, financial hubs, places like New York, London, Dubai, Sao Paulo, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, Jakarta. These are all places that are themselves massively climate stressed. So even the places, the pillars, the urban pillars of our world economy, and some of the key demographic centers in the world are in a lot of trouble if you play out these climate scenarios. And so when people say that, COVID means the end of cities and people will leave cities, that's not actually true. As I said, the city always wins throughout history. The question is, which city wins? So it's wrong to say cities are going to lose. The correct question is, which cities will win? Because for 7,000 years, cities have been in competition in some way, shape, or form with each other. So cities always have been and always will be. So New York may be losing people, Los Angeles may be losing people, but Toronto is gaining people. Dubai is gaining people. Almaty is gaining people. Berlin is gaining people. Tokyo, well, is losing people from its domestic population, but gaining foreigners. So there is a global arbitrage underway. There is a sometimes fast, sometimes slow, voluntary resettlement of people as they vote with their feet. I've been looking at population movements large and small and trying to judge and assess and measure which cities are winning, which cities are losing. Now, to be a winner means more than simply to be a star on this map. I've put stars here in a stylistic way, not in a formal way, in order to depict areas that clearly are relatively better off under climate change conditions than places that are entirely red on the map. And what I do in the book is to kind of go in a travel narrative way through these different locations. And I'm not just looking for a place that's climate stable. Every place actually has climate risks, even if it's green on the map. Just look at forest fires, right? The forest fires in Russia last year were apparently greater in volume than the forest fires in the entire rest of the world. So there's climate risk embedded even in the most stable areas. But what I'm looking for is, again, climate resilience, but also, of course, political stability, economic diversification, a culture, obviously, that is welcoming of diverse populations. So all of the features that would make for a winning formula in terms of what the new civilization centers or the next leading cities are going to be. And that's what I've been looking for. And I think more on a regional scale than simply, specific dots or cities. But it does look, of course, like, Canada, the Great Lakes region in particular, parts of Northern Europe, parts of Central Asia and other areas are high potential in many ways. So what I'm looking for is, again, what changes are they making, right? What are they doing to pre-design, to pre-build the infrastructure to prepare for larger and growing populations? And what are the other kinds of cultural and political preparations they're making as they get designated, if you will, as climate oases or climate havens? So let's talk about that adaptation, because right now, most of all the funding, most of all of the public commitments at the international level that are being made that relate to confronting or combating climate change are going into mitigation, right? Everything on the left, decarbonizing industry and supply chains, renewable energy investment, even geoengineering. All of this is an effort to reduce emissions and to try to slow down climate change. Only about 5% of that total climate expenditure, climate change related expenditure, is going into adaptation. And this is, again, where cities are on the front lines and where technology, AI or otherwise, is absolutely crucial, because we're not doing enough right now to confront or to adapt to the climate change that's already embedded in our system. We still talk about, the impact of climate change as if it's decades away, and therefore we should be doing all of these ESG kinds of things and so forth. Yes, we do need to do those things, but given that climate change is already upon us right now, we have to spend a lot more resources on adaptation as well. And again, this is where I think technology comes in terms of obviously using geospatial modeling around climate change patterns and simulating different futures. That requires a lot of computing power, obviously, and a lot of interdisciplinary work. Reducing urban heat island effects is also an area where there's a lot of geospatial work going on and a lot of Internet of Things work going on, obviously. In Singapore, for example, where I live, they have the Future Cities Laboratory that is a partner of ETH Zurich, has been using sensors everywhere to measure how the temperature, the urban temperature in Singapore, is several degrees hotter than it needs to be or should be, because of the fact that offshore chemical and other factories are operating at high power, just as a particular wind patterns are blowing that hot industrial air into the city. Meanwhile, that's exactly when people are driving their cars in the city. And also when, of course, it's middle of the day and temperatures are hottest. So, we are obvious, and of course, where air conditioners are pumped up at the highest, strongest level. So pretty much doing everything wrong at the same time in terms of creating these urban heat island effects. So what can we do better in terms of reducing them? And then, of course, what can we do in terms of new kinds of infrastructure? Can infrastructure be more mobile, more flexible? Can we do more modular, 3D printed kinds of designs and so forth? And there's, of course, a lot of work going on in that space that's really exciting. And then again, I come back to population resettlement. Ultimately, as human beings, literally biologically imbued with the fight or flight instinct, fundamentally, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to survival, the ultimate adaptation mechanism simply is moving people. And you'll never hear about that, really, not as prominently as it needs to be heard at the United Nations, because of course it's a collection of sovereign governments. Sovereign governments at the end of the day want to preserve their right to prevent the movement of people across their borders. That ultimately is the strongest vestige of sovereignty that remains in this world in which you cannot control pandemics and pollution and cyber hacks across your borders. You can still control as best as possible the movement of people. So I don't think we'll ever have a global migration accord, and yet we have to think about large-scale population resettlement at the same time. Therein lies the conundrum. Here is just a laundry list. Feel free to circulate this slide. This comes from, compiled from many reports and sources that talk about the kinds of physical adaptation solutions that we should be thinking about. And each of these, of course, involves any number of technologies, that are now part of the whole prop tech ecosystem that can help us to better cope and adapt to climate change effects, depending on whether we're talking about heat risk, flood risk, drought, fires, and so forth. And again, for every single one of these, there's now a technological approach to monitoring or combating. When it comes to relocation, I'm taking the example of the United States. There is a resorting of the population going on. The more climate models are being used, and the more we have a monitoring of climate effects and a pricing of climate effects, so that flood insurance and fire insurance rise in accordance with the geo-specific nature of the risk, the more people will be incentivized to move away from risky areas. We're seeing this happening now. The US government is asserting what's known as eminent domain, right? They're saying that if your house is destroyed by a coastal storm in Louisiana or in North Carolina or something like that, they literally will not let you go back and build there. They will not give you that subsidy, that grant, that reimbursement, that payout, which can be about $200,000 or more. They'll say, you can have this money, but you cannot come back here, right? You must move. That wasn't the case even just a few years ago. So there's a much more rationality, pragmatism, realism around this. So the question is, well, where will people go next? Where should they go next? What are people looking for? So I've been looking at this notion of climate havens. Again, I call them climate oases. Now with COVID and remote work, some people who are in the services industry and digital, in the digital economy, can make these choices. And every week you'll see a new article that says, here are the hot Zoom towns, here are the places to be, here's where it's affordable, where taxes are low, here's where, climate change is not going to have as bad an impact, and so on and so forth. So I've been looking at what are the things that the characteristics of a place that would be optimal for a young person who wants to have an affordable, high quality of life. And you can start to filter and sort and analyze locations at the zip code level, the census tract level, based on certain criteria like clean air measurements, life expectancy, the proximity to clean energy supply, the creation of jobs in the technology sector, infrastructure investment, the ranking of the quality of infrastructure. We have data for everything, really, for every metric you can imagine in the US, less so, quite frankly, in other countries. America has tons of data, even if it doesn't act on it. So that brings me final couple of points. This is what I'm doing in my work. So we've launched a company called Climate Alpha. Climate Alpha is at the intersection of, uses actually machine learning and artificial intelligence. We use convolutional neural networks to analyze a large range of.
All right.
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. Just to let you know that you have like 3 minutes before the Q&A session.
Sure. So we use machine learning to analyze the historical data on which indicators have shaped property markets in the US, and we've layered in climate modeling, and we blend them together, and we use different weights and algorithms to kind of make predictions around property values. We have assigned to every location in the United States a resilience index score or set of scores. One is around risks, one is around social vulnerability, and the third is around readiness. And each of these 3 buckets has a score, and that score generates a coefficient. The coefficient helps to condition the predictions around property values and asset prices all across the country. And the hope is that this will be used not only for disclosure requirements that the public sector is increasingly active in demanding, but also that the community of investors, whether it's real estate, asset management, insurance, are going to use this data to start to reprice geography, and for resilient areas to be incentivized or make them incentivized to be places where we have more active relocation. And if we do that through this data, then people will actually have less exposure to climate risk, lower insurance costs, and so forth. And all of this is done through what's called scenario-based forecasting. Scenario-based forecasting means that because of this uncertainty that I began with, right? We don't know where the next pandemic will break out and which places will perform better or worse in terms of their healthcare systems. We don't know whether tax rates are going to increase or decrease. We don't know whether climate change is going to be more or less extreme. What we do is we constantly run and rerun and test hypotheses and sort of customer requirements and mandates in order to come up with optimal solutions, but knowing full well that given the uncertainty, you always have to track the data and calibrate and see where you are on the prediction curve that you've made at any given time, and keep on modifying. And that's how, when I talked at the beginning about coping with complexity and anticipatory governance, the human mind, I think, can't capture these things as well as machine learning can. So this is all part ultimately of the kind of AI agenda. So the final point I'll make in closing is that the vision that I want to share and impart is that we have this misalignment, as I said before, this misalignment of demographics, resources, borders, and infrastructure. The mandate, the necessity, the urgency for all of us is to think about how we reprogram our geography. So if I could boil down my mission, if you will, to 2 words, it would be programmable geography. Not taking the map of the world for granted, not believing that the way we have inherited our borders is the way they must be, that the cities of today will be the cities of tomorrow, that we are stuck, if you will, that people are stuck where they are. Rather, we need to be very, very dynamic in the future and thinking about this allocation. And in that fluid way, again, not only cope with complexity, but anticipate it and think about a realignment of these layers of geography. And that, to me, is what the future of our civilization should be, something beyond the kind of sovereignty that's dominated our mindsets and our practices for the last several centuries, and instead move towards a much more fluid world, a world in which there's a greater mobility and fungibility of people, of investment, of resources and so forth. So I'll wrap up there, and back to all of you. Looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Parag, for this really fascinating lecture. So yes, now we'll have our Q&A session as usual. Feel free to virtually raise your hand. And just before asking your question, don't forget to quickly introduce yourself to Parag. Yes, Tanya.
Hi, Parag. Thank you very much for the lecture. It's really, really interesting. I'm a PhD candidate at the Delft University of Technology. I do research on spatial analysis of material stock and flow data, so like waste data or material stock data, to generate insights for circular economy and circular area development. My question is about your scenario forecasting. So like the second last slide, I'm really curious about that because I've recently been looking into that for my own research as well, and sort of saw like the Shell scenario, like the company Shell doing scenarios. And I'm just curious what the methodology is, and can you elaborate on that, like how the scenarios are defined, and then how they get integrated into this, something qualitative, the scenarios get integrated into a quantitative spatial analysis. Thanks.
Sure. Well, actually, it's in a way we do things quite differently from Shell. I've worked with Shell myself, actually, on scenarios, many iterations over the years. Their scenarios are a mix of qualitative and quantitative, you might say, but it's very narrative driven at the end of the day. They're literally constructing narratives that are mildly mutually exclusive from each other for the purpose of painting these different kinds of pathways. Ours are entirely quantitative, right? Entirely. It's the scenario-based forecasting is about saying, if you manipulate the population density of a given location, what is the price effect on different asset classes of real estate? If you have a high emissions scenario, and the storm risk and the heat risk and the flood risk changes nationally, and attributable to or calibrated to the geographies according to different climate models, what price effect is that actually going to have? And if you were to be blending these different variables, meaning, let's say climate change is really bad, but government expenditure goes up and adaptation investments are made, and there is more investments in renewable energy, and you have to model all of those variables simultaneously, you have to first understand to what extent those variables have interacted in the past. And then you have to make some extrapolation around that. But you're also manipulating those variables in the future in the context of climate change, in which their impact on each other will not be the same as the impact that it was in the past, which is why you need neural networks in terms of the kind of machine learning methodology. So as I say, it's entirely quantitative in nature, and its outcome is always a price prediction of an asset. Yes, of course, there's a narrative in the sense that you can also build a scenario without respect to modeling a specific asset. For example, I gave the example of Zoom towns earlier. You can say, if you have a high climate change or rapid climate change scenario, and you want to identify the places that under those conditions will still have the least storm risk, the lowest number of extra hot days, where you will still have an adequate groundwater supply, that are proximate to cities of a certain population size or airports, that are in locations with a high degree of renewable energy potential in their grids and have low air pollution, right? You can tick, filter for those things, and you'll get a map that will pop up. Now, that's a scenario, right? It's because you've established a certain set of conditions that you have strategically or arbitrarily selected, and looked for which places meet all of those criteria in this scenario future, and then those become destinations that you may want to invest in. So that's how we do scenario-based forecasting.
Just one quick question. How do you, because you mentioned, we can't predict when the next pandemic is going to be. So how will that be incorporated? or is that sort of the responsibility of whoever is using your tool?
No, so in the resilience index, where I showed you the risk, vulnerability, and resilience clusters, each of the 3 clusters has components, 6 to 8 different indicators. In the vulnerability and readiness components, we bring in socioeconomic variables like the per capita income, the number of hospital beds, the poverty rate, the adaptation investments, so the actual physical infrastructure quality, and all of these kinds of things that each have a correlation to the stability of assets in those locations. So even if they're unknown things, what you're looking for is the capacity to maintain value despite those negative things. So you can also quantify the unknown in that sense through scenarios.
Very cool. Thank you.
Hi, Parag. My name's Omar. Thank you for the presentation. It's quite insightful. I'm based in Montreal, Canada, and I conduct audits of metro station and assess their accessibility. And my question is around if the models and the frameworks that you're talking about, do they incorporate equity? And if they do, how do you go about doing that? And just to add the context why I'm asking this question is, you talked about, the New York City, a lot of the projects that they're doing are mostly around mitigation, and only 5% are adaptation. And with climate change, the size of the vulnerable communities is just increasing and increasing. So that's one of the points where I'm curious about how equity comes in. And then the other thing is, if people are going to migrate or relocate themselves, right? Who gets the opportunity to actually relocate?
Right.
So the equity point comes in there as well.
Great, it does in both ways. So one is more local, the other is more global. On the local point, again, this is all embedded in our vulnerability and the readiness scoring. So places with high inequality, places where, and we have this data is available in the United States at the census tract level, at the zip code level, which is very, sort of quite granular. You're able to know what percentage of the population spends 50% of their income on mortgage or rental payments. That's a red flag. That's a vulnerability sort of area. So where you have a high number of poor people, where you have that social vulnerability, where you have poor quality infrastructure, there's another one, which is the percentage of buildings that's built before the year 1990, right? So that's another scoring that we use. So there's many metrics that correspond to or that imply a degree of either, a large number of vulnerable population according to socioeconomic conditions, environmental conditions, or otherwise. Conversely, this data can be used in a proactive way, because in countries like the US and other countries, there's a proactive effort to identify what are called opportunity zones, right? So places with high vulnerability are being branded as opportunity zones, and therefore there are tax rebates available for making investments in those areas. So ideally, you have a situation where places of high vulnerability, social vulnerability, are also places where people are encouraged to invest to some degree. So these are the ways in which, and as we get that information, some of which what I just mentioned on opportunity zones is obviously qualitative, right? A place has been designated as a place that deserves greater investment. So we can assign a score to a place that has been designated as an opportunity zone, and therefore flag it and rank it according to places that may or may not gain investment, or track whether or not they've gained investment over time, and then measure whether or not a place that has been designated as an opportunity zone has actually received more investment based simply on looking at the economic data of that place. So that's just one or two examples of how equity sort of, comes into the picture. On a global scale, that's what I've spent much more time looking at is, what are the present and potentially future geographical dyads of demographic shifts. Now, the fact is that even though there's large vulnerable populations in South America and in Africa, geologically speaking and geopolitically speaking, it's more difficult for those populations to relocate. Most of the human population literally lives on the Eurasian landmass, which is a contiguous geography, and most of the climate stressed people in the world technically are in Asia. So I've been looking, for example, at the potential vectors of Asian populations that are most vulnerable to climate change. Most of that climate migration, whether it's in Asia or whether it's in Africa or elsewhere, is still going to be domestic or regional, right? We already have large-scale regional climate-related migration in South America, in Central America, and in Africa, especially in East Africa, for example. So this is not new. You could also say that in West Asia, in the Arab world, there's been significant climate migration, because you can attribute, of course, to some degree, the Syrian civil war, Yemen's conflict, and so forth. There are climate dimensions to these conflicts, so it's difficult just to isolate them. So I've been looking at the livable geographies in those areas and analyzing, to what extent, or forecasting to what extent their populations may rise given the climate stress. So, for example, I have a whole section of the book on Eastern Anatolia, right? So Eastern Turkey. Now, this is an area that is not far from the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is a very verdant area, and it's depopulating right now because Turks have been moving from east to west. And so, but immediately south of this region are Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and so forth, which are thoroughly climate-stressed countries, suffering from droughts and searing heat waves. So I'm forecasting that the Arab, Persian populations of this Turkish region are probably going to grow over time, like it or not. I'm also looking at South and Southeast Asian populations and how their numbers will migrate outward, probably north into Central Asia, west towards Europe, and so forth. It won't only be because of climate change. It's actually happening now anyway, simply by virtue of demographics, right? The fact that India has a youth labor surplus, and it has, overeducated English-speaking people who are seeking to move and relocate. So the Asian population of Europe has grown very significantly in the last 15, 20 years. And the South Asian population of Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and even into Russia has been growing. Again, relatively small numbers, but in terms of indicative geographical kind of vectors, I see those dyads actually growing considerably over time. That doesn't mean it's going to be a peaceful and orderly and premeditated process, but you can see evidence of labor migration accords. For example, Russia and India have signed one, in which Russia is actually seeking to import Indian farmers, to take just one example. Eastern European countries are looking for Pakistani construction workers, right? These kinds of things are also happening. So again, in bits and pieces, we're starting to see faint signals of what may lie ahead.
Awesome, that was quite fascinating. Thank you very much.
Ruth, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Ruth Nelson. I'm doing a PhD at TU Delft in the Netherlands. And I have two questions. So from my understanding, essentially with your company, you're trying to basically predict future value of assets, right? And I'm wondering, the variables that you use and the different indicators, if they're sort of overall sort of universal sort of variables, which you can say will always have an effect on these assets, or if it's highly contextually dependent. That's my first question. And I have a quick second question, which it sounds like you're working with a lot of private investors. And I was wondering if you work with governments at all, or because it sounds like, cities are always looking to attract investment. They're always looking to attract a good labor market. Potentially if this could feed into certain policies in cities to kind of mitigate certain effects. Yeah. So those are basically my two questions.
No, those are great questions. On the first one, in terms of, well, let me actually take the second question first. In terms of work with the public sector, so our resilience scorecard, because it provides sort of a dashboard that cities, municipalities can use to identify their strengths and weaknesses with respect to emerging climate conditions, it does have very strong public sector applications, and we're licensing it to an entity called Statebook that services the economic development organizations of cities and city regions. So, and then also we are being asked by, for example, the US military, the Army and the Navy, to provide this dashboard so that their installations can better prepare for climate effects. So we're happy to provide this data to cities, to towns, and to, again, federal or civil authorities, so that they can really use it as an action plan, if you will. On your first question, we are providing price predictions, but more importantly, we're providing rankings. And the correct way to do scenarios isn't really in a determinative way, even though we are providing price predictions. It's about saying, under a certain condition, what is the ranking of outcomes, meaning what is most likely to happen in terms of which places will benefit from 1 through 3,000 counties, rather than pinpointing an exact dollar value. We are providing a dollar value, but it may not be correct. What's more likely to be correct is the ranking of performance. So it leaves obviously margin for error. That's the first point. The second is around the data sets and the kind of causal mechanisms. When it comes to the United States, we started out with more than 100 data sets to try to reconstruct the last 25 years of property transactions in the US, and a couple of things emerged. First is about 40 to 50 indicators were more statistically significant than the rest. So you could pretty much strip away a whole bunch of things that are useful, but not necessarily determinative. So we were left with about, again, those 50 variables that are essential to bring down your historical error to below 3%, which is what we got to. Secondly, across countries, we haven't actually fully modeled other countries besides the United States. The United States is most definitely more complex than any other country. So the hardest country is already done. But for other countries, it will be fewer than 45 data sets. It'll probably be, take Canada or the UK or, probably a, European country, probably 30 to 35 data sets, or less would deliver similar accuracy. And secondly, whether or not they're the same or different, they could be different. So if an economy is very natural resource dependent, then having data sets around the geographical location of industrial, assets is going to matter more than potentially data sets that relate to education levels broken down at the municipal level. To take one, not so hypothetical example, it's certainly true of even wealthy countries like Canada. So there is going to be some variation in the kinds of, in some of the data. So it'll be a mix of reconstructing data sets we already have and getting it for other countries, as well as looking for the nuances of specific countries at the same time.
Okay, thank you so much for your insights.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Parag. Thank you very much for your presentation. You have done an amazing work in this field. My name is Gustavo Maldonado. I am a special data scientist and an architect. I currently work on a startup on the logistic industry that is working across Latin America, and I am from Ecuador. So I have two questions that are actually kind of connected. The first one is, okay, we are pretty much aware of this climate change, but which strategies from your company experience perspective have you used to create this aware that people, public sector and companies should use data in order to solve this kind of climate change problems? Because there's this gap between what people that manage data or this kind of analysis do and what the people in general usually think about climate change. That's my first question. And of course, also related to this, how do you see the adoption of these kind of technologies for the companies? Are they putting the advantages of the climate, of these climate advantages first than the economic values from other parts of the city where you can perhaps exploit more this kind of natural resources or
Sure.
any other things?
So on the first question, I think that it's hard to generalize about whether or not, populations are interested or disinterested. It obviously depends on the place. What we found in the United States is that younger populations are far more climate sensitive and aware. So for example, surveys show that young people are far less likely to purchase a home in a climate risk, high climate risk area, whereas older people are much less conditioned by sort of climate thinking. So that is an example, and this is very clear. It really is showing up in housing data and so forth. So I think we can't generalize. The fact is that, like it or not, more and more people are becoming climate aware, and that's a good thing. In terms of companies, there's no doubt that climate analytics is big business, but most of it is risk focused and ESG focused. It's not necessarily proactive in terms of, again, rethinking our spatial organization, rethinking infrastructure investment, rethinking population clusters, and actively, resorting populations. That's not really something that's done in Western societies at a large scale. Personally, I think it should be. But that's partially why we've built this, is to provide what we think of as an independent sort of, again, assessment or set of assessments and scenarios that can help the public sector be more proactive.
Thanks.
Hi, Parag. Thank you for your lecture today. I'm Anna. My background is on geospatial data science, and I currently am a data scientist at Bain & Company. So I'm working on artificial intelligence for different industries. You sort of addressed this while answering Ruth's question, so it can be quick. But can you share insights on assessing areas with poor data availability at a granular level? You talked about migration data on the US at a zip code level, but this is only true for a few countries. So I'm wondering about strategies like remote sensing or crowdsourced data, or even AI methodologies to sort of predict the unavailable data, but then uncertainty is added. So this is always something I'm wondering about.
It's a good question. Definitely, we're interested in remote sensing technologies when it comes to things like, modeling or looking at where urban tree cover, for example, is improving or expanding, and the impact that has on urban resilience. That's one example. Another is sentiment analysis. So looking at social media feeds and how they correlate to property markets in a place. There's obviously a very complex methodologies associated with that. Mobility data around mobile phone signals, and how do you parse and analyze those, and what do they really tell us, depending on how much time someone has spent away from the geography in which their mobile phone is registered. So many different kinds of high frequency data sets that we're looking at and working with, to try to figure out what relevance they have and what they correlate to, and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
Parag, we have one last question. Will it be okay
Sure.
for you? I know. Yes,
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
I have to run after that. Sure.
Okay, I'll try to make it quick. I'm Gabor. I'm an IoT engineer in Taiwan, and I'm very much interested in the less quantitative and more of the cultural aspect of migration. I come from Hungary, which is a country famous for its anti-migration stand, while, as you also mentioned, it's a country that's seeking South Asian workers for milking cows and doing all kinds of work, but they try to hide it because it comes at a political cost if the public finds out. And there's just this general negative sense of migration in Europe. And I think that's partially because migrants are an easy target, easy to blame problems on them, easy to make them political targets, and the local elite just wants to preserve their current status. But since migration will be a huge theme for the next century, what is the most pragmatic way of protecting the vulnerable people? And have you seen any positive examples where maybe a certain culture is more ahead in building this migration-friendly attitude? Like I know, for example, in Jordan, because of the sheer amount of conflict surrounding the country, there are so many refugees that it became sort of just part of normal life.
Right.
And I was wondering, is this what's waiting for us, or is there any other way it can play out?
Well, I mean, climate refugees don't yet outnumber political refugees, but if we take all asylum seekers, refugees, involuntarily displaced peoples together, it's well over 100 million people. And of course, Europe has received many of them. The United States has as well. In terms of proactive strategies, I do believe demonstration effects really matter. Let's face it, Hungary is not a country where other countries say, oh, I want to model my immigration policy in Hungary because that's the way to attract talent, right? It's kind of the opposite. Of course, you are, as a affordable destination, a place that's getting Western Europeans and Americans to come and move there. But what I think is when you look for role models, you look at Canada. Canada is a place where lots of young people are going. It's ranked as a place with a high quality of life, with an expanding economy, diversifying economy, a percentage of jobs that are being created that are full time rather than just being part time. Sort of gig work is also higher. So these are the kinds of things that people look for. So I think that demonstration effects matter. And rather than us having an attitude that all of our countries are populist and xenophobic and nationalist, it's certainly true some of the time. But you also have very strong countries like Canada, like Germany, that have, whether they like it or not, voluntarily or involuntarily, been on the receiving end of large numbers of migrants, and they have been able to absorb as many of them as possible in a peaceful, stable way. And the politics have not given way towards, right-wing populism. So I think that given the demographics of your country, of all of our Western countries, of all OECD countries, there are those that have realized that they need to embrace that immigration and craft a narrative that portrays it as being mutually beneficial, versus those that don't, and those that create a sort of a divisive attitude. And fortunately, some very, very important countries, like Canada, like Germany, are proving to be positive role models, and I hope that other countries will learn from them.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Well, thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
Thanks, Parag, for this fascinating lecture, for taking the time to answer all the questions. I know that you have to jump up to another meeting, so really thanks a lot for this. For those of you who want to stay in the room and discuss this lecture, you are more than welcome. And for the other one, see you next week for our next lecture with Nadine Gale. It will be about Internet of Nature.
Cool.
Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.